Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning to everyone in the room, and it's lovely to see you all here. And good morning to everyone on Zoom, and it's lovely to see you all there. And to everyone watching on YouTube as well. This really is a multi-channel event, but it is particularly lovely to see people in real life in the audience. We're going to run this as we usually do. I will spend a few minutes introducing our findings, as it were, from the last 18 hours or so. I'll then hand over to Carl Emerson, who will talk about the public finances, Ben Zaranko, who will talk about the spending review, Stuart Adam, who will talk about some of the tax changes, and Xiaowei Zhu, who will talk about benefits and living standards. There will then be plenty of time for questions at the end. People obviously in the room can raise their hands. People on Zoom can also raise their hands, and people on YouTube can put things into the Slido link that you have. Let me start. This was a big event. Fiscally speaking, I reckon this was a once-in-a-decade event, up there with 1979, which I can just about remember, when Geoffrey Howe cut direct taxes, increased VAT, set out a new monetarist agenda. 1993, when Norman Lamont and Kenneth Clarke introduced huge tax increases and started a parliament of retrenchment. 2002, Gordon Brown showed his intentions to increase public spending and increase taxes. And 2010, when George Osborne set the stage for a long period of austerity. To that list, we can now add 2021. This is the year when a Conservative Chancellor raised taxes by £40 billion or so, when the tax burden was put firmly on a path to exceed 6% of national income, and hence settle at a record sustained level, a full 2.7% of national income, higher than it was in 2019. And when public spending was increased across the board to take the size of the state to a level not seen in normal times since those days of Geoffrey Howe. It's important to be clear, this is almost entirely a set of policy choices unrelated to the pandemic. What we've had is a Chancellor responding to the ever-increasing demands of an ageing population and a healthcare system on the one hand, and the increasingly dire plight of the likes of justice, social care, and the prison system, starved of funding for a decade. He's also presided over big increases in capital spending put in place by his predecessor. Compared with pre-pandemic plans set out in March 2020, the big change has actually been the health and social care levy. Can someone give me another copy of this, because mine hasn't come out? Possibly not. Thank you, Laris. Whoop, sorry. That's very embarrassing. Compared with pre-pandemic plans set out in March 2020, the big change has in fact been the health and social care levy. That's allowed spending on health to rise 4% a year over the next 3 years without creating its traditional squeeze on other departments. Otherwise, what yesterday's budget did was largely take spending rises penciled in back in 2020, which had been rubbed out again in March 2021, and allocate them to spending lines other than health. Now, a crucial ingredient in this year's policy decisions has been the way in which OBR forecasts appear to have driven policy. Back in March, the OBR was forecasting a bigger long-term hit to the economy, which would have left borrowing well short of current budget balance, one of Mr. Sunak's key objectives. So he announced big tax rises. With more positive economic and fiscal outlook, he's not decided to reverse any of those tax rises. He's decided to bank them, raise spending, and bring borrowing in below pre-pandemic forecasts. Had he not topped up his spending plans, he could have reversed a third of those March tax increases. This is a Chancellor who has responded to a hole in the public finances by relying more than entirely on tax rises to do the repair job. Contrast that with his recent predecessors. All of this gives him some cushion against the OBR becoming more pessimistic again. Indeed, if the forecasts are correct, he could find space for a pre-election tax giveaway of perhaps £7 billion and still maintain some fiscal headroom. But given his newly stated fiscal targets, it's not a huge or comfortable cushion. The main fiscal targets are, as expected. He's targeting debt falling and current budget balance both on a 3-year rolling basis. Mr. Sunak will for sure be hoping he doesn't have to answer the question how to respond if forecasts change so that it looks like he'll miss them. He surely won't want to increase taxes even further, and it will be quite a policy reversal to abandon his promised spending increases. Maybe, like many other recent chancellors, he'd just live with missing the targets. The worry for the government is that for all the Chancellor's upbeat delivery, the voters may not get much feel-good factor. High inflation, rising taxes, poor growth, still undermined more by Brexit than by the pandemic, will see real living standards barely rising, and for many, falling over the next year. So on public spending, the increases announced are genuine, they're real, they're substantial. No department is seeing a cut to its overall budget, and only defence a cut to current spending. Some, such as justice, which would have been braced for cuts, are getting big increases. There's money in the short term to support services with additional costs arising from COVID. In truth, it's bizarre that implausibly low totals were penciled in for next year in the first place. And the Chancellor has sensibly left himself with a bigger than usual reserve to be allocated at a later date. For many areas, though, spending will still be substantially less in 2024 than it was back in 2010. That'll be true of justice and local government, for example. Perhaps the most striking contrast lies in what's happened to health and education spending. Over this spending review period, education spending is set to rise by about 2% a year, against 4% for health. Over the whole period since 2010, though, health spending will have increased by over 40%, education spending by less than 3%. For the Chancellor to have felt it appropriate to draw attention to the fact that per pupil spending in schools will have returned to 2010 levels by 2024 is perhaps a statement of a remarkable lack of priority afforded to the education system. A decade and a half with no growth in spending, despite some economic growth, is unprecedented. Spending per student in further education, sixth form college will remain well below 2010 levels. This is not a set of priorities which looks consistent either with long-term growth or indeed levelling up. One area that may still face a bit of a struggle is local government. Despite a real increase in spending power, tighter limits on what can be raised in council tax, the fact that grants are being frozen after next year, a continued failure to update funding formulae, and the demands of social care could still see some local authorities having to cut services. It's also worth noting that health spending was topped up again, partly because of a higher inflation forecast, partly because the OBR expects the health and care levy to raise more money. The latter is a nonsense. We can be sure of two things. The amount the NHS needs is entirely unrelated to how much the health and social care levy raises, and had revenues moved in the other direction, I think we can be fairly sure that NHS spending would not have been cut. Just one small irritation. There were lots of pre-briefings for extra money for health and skills over the weekend. They served only to obfuscate. I have to say, I think maybe the Speaker was unduly concerned about the Chancellor revealing too much early. The truth is the briefings revealed nothing, at least on those areas. On living standards, the Chancellor's presentation was upbeat. He claimed beforehand this was a budget to usher in a new age of optimism. But unfortunately for him and for us, the outlook for living standards doesn't match that upbeat tone. Over the next several years, a combination of tax increases and high inflation will mean very slow growth in living standards. A middle earner is likely to be worse off next year than this, as high rates of inflation and tax rises more than negate small average wage increases. And of course, that comes on top of a decade of historically feeble increases in real incomes. The gap between what we might have expected on the basis of pre-financial crisis trends and what is actually happening is staggering. Average gross earnings could have been even 40% higher had pre-crisis trends continued. The primacy of asset accumulation, the importance of asset holdings over the possibility of getting better off through earnings is being maintained well into a second decade. With, in the words of the OBR, inflation quite possibly hitting its highest rate in the UK for 3 decades, millions will be worse off in the short term. Next April, benefits will rise by just over 3%. Inflation could easily be 5%. That'll be a real, if temporary, hit of hundreds of pounds a year for many benefit recipients. It reminds me of when I was studying in the 1980s, reading analyses from the 1970s of the hardship caused by inflation, when benefits and earnings increases lagged price rises. We're not in the 1970s levels of inflation, but we are now experiencing enough inflation that real pain will be felt as low-income households most of whom have little in the way of financial assets, wait more than a year for their incomes to catch up. For some in work, of course, that may never happen. Two policies, though, will benefit many low earners. The first is the uplift in the national living wage. That's one of the few points of continuity between Chancellor Osborne and Chancellor Sunak. Though even the increase of over 6% will feel less generous if inflation is at 5% at that moment. Second, the cut in the universal credit taper and the increase in the work allowance will, as the Chancellor claimed, benefit around 2 million in-work recipients of universal credit. It'll be worth about the same as the £20 a week uplift to the full-time worker on the minimum wage. But one illustration of the trade-offs, a lone parent with just one child and a relatively modest rent will now have to earn well over £40,000 just to move off universal credit. The taper's been cut, but a lot more people will be affected by it, the inevitable trade-offs in the benefit system. Overall, the policies coming into effect in April will be highly progressive relative to the position today. Gains for low earners, and as a result of the national insurance and tax increases, losses for higher earners. It remains the case, though, working age benefit system is substantially less generous than it was in 2015. Since then, tax and benefit changes have hit the poor and favoured the better off. The position for those out of work, particularly those without children, remains precarious indeed. No increase in out-of-work benefits for the childless unemployed for half a century, leaving their living standards dramatically trailing those of the working majority. The gap between the generosity of the furlough system and the meanness of our out-of-work benefit system could hardly be more stark. So, unsurprisingly, given the scale of increases announced earlier in the year, the tax changes we heard about yesterday were modest, though Stuart will talk about them. A welcome reform to alcohol taxation, some modest tinkering with business rates and air passenger duty. The story of this budget, then, is one of spending increases and a worrying outlook for living standards. The story of the fiscal year as a whole also encapsulates those historic tax increases. In the end, Mr. Sunak has bowed to the demands created by public services which have suffered a decade of cuts and to the inevitability of increased spending on the NHS. If he is to achieve the ambition he set out at the end of his speech to get taxes down and reduce the size of the state, then he's going to have to come up with some pretty new and radical ways to manage those pressures. He'd be helped by an economy growing rather more enthusiastically than it's managed for some time now. Finding the key either to reforming public services to make them cheaper and more efficient, or to getting the higher economic growth, are challenges which have defeated most of his predecessors. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand over to Carl, then Ben, then Stuart, then Jiawei. And please do ask questions on Slido, and we'll come to others as well at the end. Thank you.
So in this talk, I'm going to go through the projections for borrowing and the outlook for the public finances that the forecast produced just before the pandemic struck in March 2020, the ones produced a year later in March 2021, and the ones we saw yesterday. It's back in 2019-20, largely before the pandemic had hit the UK, borrowing was running at around £50 billion, and actually at that point in time it was expected to remain around that level over the medium term. In the last financial year, we ended up borrowing a lot more than that because of the pandemic and the associated lockdowns. It's worth noting that the latest estimate suggests that we actually borrowed about £35 billion less than was expected back in March. That's one way of highlighting the uncertainty in the public finances. In March 2021, the OBR's best guess of how much we would borrow in the financial year that was just about to end is wrong to the tune of £35 billion. So there's lots of uncertainties. In the current financial year, it looks like borrowing is going to be about £50 billion lower than was expected in March. That's exactly the same as what we told you about in our brief budget just a few weeks ago. But at £180 billion, the deficit still is pretty high. As a share of national income, in peacetime, that's only been exceeded in the UK, either in the Great Financial Crisis or in 2021. Over the next few years, as the economy recovers, as the tax rises kick in, the deficit's forecast to fall, I think it's interesting to note that in the last year shown here, in 24-25, the Chancellor's now planning to borrow £46 billion. That's not just less than what he was expecting back in March. That's actually £12 billion less than what he was expecting before the pandemic had struck. So he's aiming for a lower level of borrowing in the medium run than what he was going for prior to the pandemic. So why are we getting to lower borrowing? Well, it's not because of cuts to spending as a share of national income. So this chart shows you total public spending as a share of GDP going back to 1997. And I think the key takeaway here is that the pandemic pushed up spending a lot, but post-pandemic it's settling down at a higher level than what we had pre-pandemic. Now that's different to what happened after the financial crisis, where spending was pushed up a lot, but Mr. Osborne as Chancellor then proceeded over a decade to push spending back down, so it reached roughly the level it was at prior to the pandemic. Looking at the other side of the total revenues, you can see that's what's driving the reduction in borrowing over the next few years. It's revenues growing very strongly over the next couple of years as a share of GDP. And if you look at the gap between the two, that's the amount the government's borrowing, you can see that it's actually going to be lower than what we were borrowing pre-pandemic. So the gap between revenues and spending at the end of the chart is smaller than what it was, say, in 2018, 2019. If we strip out investment spending and just look at day-to-day spending by government, we can see that the government's planning to increase investment spending. That's something that Ben will talk about. But we can also see that total revenues are now set to exceed day-to-day spending. That matters because it's one of the fiscal objectives that the Chancellor has. It's similar to what Mr. Osborne and indeed Gordon Brown wanted to do. And if these forecasts are correct, total revenues will exceed day-to-day spending by a larger amount than we've seen in the UK since around 2000-2001, when Gordon Brown was Chancellor. Why are revenues growing as a share of national income? Well, government gets its income mainly from taxes. If we just look at tax revenue as a share of GDP, you can see, not surprisingly, that's what's driving the increase. It's the increase in the tax burden over the next few years. And as the Chancellor said in his budget speech yesterday, that's being pushed up to a level that we haven't seen in the UK since the early 1950s, and to a level that we haven't sustained in the UK pretty much ever. So let's look in a bit more detail about why the size of the state, both in terms of spending and in terms of taxes, is ending up bigger than what it was pre-pandemic. So starting with spending, back in 2018-19, public spending just over 39% of national income. We reckon that the kind of direct automatic effect of the pandemic is to push up spending a bit. That's not because the economy is looking like it's going to be smaller in the medium run. In cash terms, it looks like the economy is going to be pretty much the same, at least according to the OBR forecast, as what was expected pre-pandemic. The reason why spending is being pushed up a bit is because it now looks like we'll have a few more people of working age receiving working age benefits, adding to public spending. The other drivers are the increase in capital spending, largely the choice of the Chancellor's predecessor, Sajid Javid, to increase spending there pretty dramatically, plus an increase in day-to-day spending, which in part is due to the choices that Mr. Sunak has made this year to increase spending on health and social care. So that leads us into a position where public spending is reaching around 41.5% of national income. And I think it's worth noting that, at least on these calculations, the direct impact of the pandemic, we reckon, counts for about a fifth, explains about a fifth of the increase in the size of the state, so a minority of that increase. What about the tax side? Well, tax burden was running at about just under 34% of national income. Again, prior to the pandemic, when Mr. Javid was Chancellor, he was planning for the tax, his forecast involved the tax burden growing over time. We've seen the pandemic hit. We think that's going to have pretty much no effect on the tax burden as a share of GDP, in large part because the nominal size of the economy is not being reduced in the medium term, at least according to the OBR's forecasts. So why is the tax burden growing? Well, it's the big package of tax rises that we heard about back in March, and it's the new health and social care levy that the Prime Minister announced last month. Other tax policy measures, a small modest tax cut. Stuart will talk a little bit about some of those. It doesn't really register. Overall, that pushes the tax burden up to 36% of national income. So why is the tax burden going up? Well, I think 80% of the increase on this chart is explained by the £45 billion rise in corporate and personal taxes that were pushed up in March and September. So 80% of the increase in the tax burden is coming from that. It's also worth noting, because we're saying that the pandemic isn't having much of an enduring impact on the deficit, it's only having a modest one, these tax rises are really big, they're explaining over 100% of the repair job in the public finances. Now, that's in contrast to Mr. Osborne, who repeatedly said he wanted to see, after the financial crisis, a mix of 80% spending cuts, 20% tax rises. And broadly speaking, that's what he delivered. And roughly speaking, it's also very different to the approach of Norman Lamont, Ken Clarke, where at least it looks like, roughly speaking, it was about 50-50 spending cuts and tax rises in terms of fixing the public finances in the early 90s. Mr. Sunak's cure to the fiscal problem we have now is over 100% of the damage being repaired through tax rises. Finally, I want to talk about the fiscal targets. Paul would only let me have one slide on this, even though there's 9 to talk about. The first is a new mandate for fiscal policy. The Chancellor wants to have debt falling as a share of GDP between the second and the third year of the forecast horizon. So it's a forward-looking target. It doesn't give the Chancellor much wriggle room. You could have a short, sharp shock and still have debt go up and then down again and you'd be okay. But any enduring recession, you're going to end up breaching or having to suspend that target. One thing to note, it excludes the impact of the Bank of England. That does not mean it's excluding the quantitative easing. What it does mean, if the Bank of England chooses to expand its balance sheet in order to, for example, make loans to businesses, as it did after the Brexit referendum, that impact is ignored. And that's sensible to do. It's a better guide to fiscal policy. And by excluding it, it actually makes the rule harder to meet. So that's a good thing, we think. 3 further supplementary targets. We're going to be aiming for a current budget balance by the third year of the forecast horizon. I think we can argue about whether 3 years is too short or too long a timescale, but I think the idea of a forward-looking current budget balance target is a very good one. It's one that the Green Budget has advocated for many years, plus 2 caps on different parts of public spending, a cap on investment spending, and a cap on welfare spending. There's also 5 other indicators that are going to be considered, which are around the affordability of debt and the wider public sector balance sheet. So you can look forward to future presentations going into lots of detail on all 9 of these. 9 fiscal targets. You wonder why the Chancellor didn't just go for 10 and have 10 fiscal commandments. Another sensible feature in here is the Treasury said that if there is a significant negative economic shock, the rule will be suspended. And that's a sensible idea. We don't want to be trying to keep to these rules if it's inappropriate to do so. So how much wiggle room? Well, I'm just going to focus on the first one, the first fiscal mandate, public sector net debt as a share of national income. Prior to the pandemic, that was basically flat, despite the Conservatives' manifesto committing to reducing debt as a share of GDP. We see debt rising pretty sharply in the forecast in March because of all the borrowing we've done in the last 18 months. It now rises to a lower level and stabilises before falling slightly. So is the Chancellor meeting his target? Well, he needs to have debt falling between 23-24 and 24-25, and he is doing that. It's forecast to fall by 0.6% of national income, so the rule is being met. There's no issue about wiggle room here. It's just a forward-looking target for 3 years' time. It is met. The question to ask is, will it be met next year? So let's assume now that the forecasts don't move. In a year's time, we will see debt still forecast to fall by 0.9% of national income. So if the forecasts don't change, he'll be meeting it again in a year's time as the target rolls on a year. But of course, forecasts can change. We've looked through the last 16 autumn forecasts, and in 6 occasions, they have moved by more than the 0.9% headroom that he currently has in. So you might think a 6 out of 16 chance of a breach. My view is that on 3 of those occasions, the government would have triggered the economic get-out clause for a significant shock because of the global financial crisis and because of the pandemic. I think on the other 3 occasions, they wouldn't have triggered it and they would have breached the rule or would have been forced into more fiscal action. That's a judgment. I can't imagine the government deciding that the Brexit referendum result, for example, was a significant negative economic shock to the UK. So maybe a 3 in 13 chance that the Chancellor will be forced into greater fiscal action if he wants to meet this target. So to conclude, public spending is going to be bigger as a share of national income after the pandemic. There are big tax rises that were announced this year, bigger than any year that we've seen since 1993, which will cover that increase in spending and also reduce borrowing to below that planned pre-pandemic. The forecast suggests that you might be able to do some small pre-election tax cuts. We might expect that, but I think it's worth noting that the headroom against that new debt target is not large, and what the OBR gives, the OBR could take away. And of course, there is huge amounts of uncertainty around the path of the economy and the outlook for government receipts. I'll now hand over to Ben, who's going to talk in more detail about the spending plans. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. And yeah, I'm going to talk about the spending plans, and I hope that those of you at home can actually hear me. I gather some of you can't, so we can only apologise for that. The big lesson really is that a big package of tax rises and an improved economic outlook have allowed the Chancellor to be substantially more generous than he was previously planning to, and substantially more generous than he'd said he was going to be just last month. This new spending review represented the second top-up to the government's spending plans in as many months. He had a set of plans penciled in March. He then topped them up in September, topped them up again yesterday. And what that means altogether is that by the end of the Parliament, he's set to spend about 9 billion more on public services, and he was planning pre-pandemic. Now, the eagle-eyed among you may notice that that's a little less than the 12 billion or so promised to health and social care, so other departments might be doing slightly worse than he might have expected pre-COVID, but certainly better than they were expecting just a few weeks ago. And this big increase in spending plans is enough for the Chancellor to have higher health and social care spending, enough for a sizable COVID catch-up package. It goes beyond just the NHS and covers courts, it covers education, it covers transport as well, and allows them to make almost no cuts to departments. So one big lesson that the Chancellor was keen to emphasise in his statement yesterday is that departmental spending is on the rise. I'm going to show you here average planned growth in total departmental budgets, so resource and capital combined, every spending review since 1998. And you can see that over the next 3 years, total departmental budgets are set to grow by 3% a year on average over and above inflation. Now, that's not as generous as at the most recent 2 one-year spending reviews. It's certainly more generous than what we saw in the 2010s, and it's broadly comparable, if a bit less generous than what we saw in some of the Labour spending reviews of the 2000s and late 1990s. Now, within that 3% total, resource or day-to-day budgets, which departments use for paying staff and delivering and administering public services, will grow by 3.3%, and their capital budgets by 1.9%. And I'm going to talk about each of those in turn. So, first of all, overall, departmental budgets are growing, but those increases aren't being spread evenly. So overall, as I've just shown you, 3.3% average real terms growth over the next 3 years. But within that, the health and social care budget and the Ministry of Justice budget will grow by more than 4%, and some will be growing by less. So once you strip out Department of Health and Social Care, increases are still 2.8% a year, relatively chunky, but it's notable that education is doing not just worse than the average department, but worse than the average department outside of health. And I think that tells you something about this government's seeming priorities. And the Ministry of Defence, whilst it will see an increase in its overall budget because of a big increase in its investment pot, it will see a cut to its day-to-day budget due to its pre-agreed spending settlement. Now, that will see increases almost across the board, but some areas may still find the next few years a bit tricky, and perhaps nowhere is that truer than in local government. So if you think about council funding, yesterday's announcements mean that overall, the headline measure of funding for councils will go up by 3% on average over and above inflation. Now, some of that money is to pay for new social care reforms, the introduction of the more generous means test and the cap on care costs. So if you strip that out, it's more like 1.8% per year, which is a bit less generous than what the average department is seeing. But it is still a real terms increase when, until recently, they were probably bracing for cuts. But if we delve even further into the murky world of local government finance, yesterday's announcements mean that grant funding for local authorities to pay for existing services, not new reforms, will go up by about 1.6 billion next year, which is pretty sizable. But interestingly, it's then going to be frozen. Now, it makes sense for that funding to be front-loaded, given the nature of the pandemic-related pressures, which we hope will dissipate over time, and those pressures are front-loaded too, so far fairly sensible. But that subsequent freeze means that ongoing pressures after that point will need to be met predominantly through increases in local taxes. So roughly 3/4 of the increases after that will have to come from increases in council tax. And another interesting point is that the government seems to be saying that councils will be allowed to raise council tax by less than they have been able to in the recent past. So 2% general increase plus an extra 1% for social care equates to 2.8% on average, which is less than the recent past, and about flat in real terms. And one of the problems associated with relying on council tax to meet these pressures is that the councils that can raise most from council tax aren't necessarily those that have the greatest spending pressures. And it's much harder to channel funding to poorer areas if you're freezing overall grants, because increasing the grant for one area means having to cut it somewhere else. And the top line from this is that some cuts to some council services seem highly likely if the government doesn't provide additional funding, central government doesn't provide additional funding, given those rising costs and demands and what they've penciled in for council tax. And the more general lesson is that the spending increases across the board will undoubtedly be welcomed by departments that were until recently perhaps expecting cuts, but they won't undo the cuts that many of them have already endured since 2010. So if we compare spending in 2009-10 to where it's now expected to be at the end of the Parliament, overall departmental day-to-day budgets will be about 8% higher. So they've gone up, but not by much, considering that's a 15-year period. But within that, the health and social care budget have gone up by more than 40%, education less than 3%, and some areas will be still, despite, for example, the Ministry of Justice set to see increases of about 4% per year over the next few years, will still be about 12% lower by the end of this Parliament than it was prior to the cuts of the 2010s. So austerity might be over for these areas, but it will not be fully undone. And one area that the Chancellor drew attention to in his speech was the fact that they'll be returning school funding per pupil to its 2010 level. So you can see here it was cut steadily over the course of the 2010s, it's now set to rise sharply, but that will just get us back to where we were in 2010. So that will still mean 15 years of no real terms growth in school funding per pupil. But in some other areas of the education budget, that won't even be the case. Some areas the cuts will only be partially reversed. So if we look at further education, sixth form colleges, for instance, they'll still be 10% down on where they were, so only about a third of those cuts will be undone. If you look at schools, sixth form colleges, they'll still be almost a quarter down, so only about a fifth of those cuts will be undone. So some areas will be seeing welcome budget increases, in some cases quite rapid ones, but given the scale of the cuts we've already seen, that will only be a partial reversal. A few other little things to note from our overnight digging. The OBR expect that the health and social care levy will raise a bit more than the Treasury were previously expecting. Now that's been used to then top up the NHS budget, and that combined with a higher inflation forecast means about 2.5 billion extra per year on top of what was planned in September. But to reiterate what Paul said, this is not a great way to design policy. There is no world in which a lower revenue forecast from the OBR would have meant a cut to the NHS budget. It's a fundamentally asymmetric arrangement, and this hypothecated health and social care levy has no real bearing to what actually is spent on the NHS in total. The Chancellor's plans build in 10 or 11 billion of an unallocated reserve over the next 3 years, which is a sensible move given just how uncertain the future path of the virus is and virus costs and the fact he might need to come back with more support. It also might give him a bit of a rainy day fund towards the end of this Parliament if he wants to provide some giveaways to certain areas. And funding increases for COVID catch-up have been announced, not just for health, but for justice, a little bit for schools, for public transport providers and the like. But those increases were inevitable. And as recently as the 7th of September, the Chancellor was penciling in plans that said they were planning nothing on these things, which was always not going to be a serious case in reality. And it does raise the question of why they were publishing such implausibly low plans just last month. Now, moving on to capital, just before I finish. The top line here, the main message you should take away is that capital spending is set to be maintained at a high level. We still will be spending a lot on investment relative to the recent past, but that's mainly because of the prior increases we've seen in recent years being baked in rather than any big announcements in this week's spending review, which mainly just allocated funds that were already there in the plans. So this shows you government investment as a share of national income over time, and you can see that there's two spikes there during the financial crisis and during the pandemic. But the important thing is that it's going to settle at about 2.7% of GDP over the forecast period, below the government's self-imposed 3% cap, and almost double the average that it's been at over the past 40 years. And another way to look at this is the real terms year on year, so the annual changes in departments' capital budgets. And you can see they've varied quite a lot over the past decade or so. But the key thing really is the big rapid increases over the past 3 or 4 years, particularly the last 2 years. So 17% growth in 2020-21 and 13% last year has got capital spending to a high level. And now it's still going to grow by an average of 1.9% a year over the spending review period. But that's mainly just to keep it at its new higher level rather than to keep ramping it up further. A few final thoughts. The Treasury has made a big deal this year of pre-briefing lots of spending announcements, most of which were partial, very difficult to interpret, and in lots of cases close to meaningless. I would say that they didn't need to do so. There were lots of genuine, real increases in this budget and in this spending review. There was no need to resort to releasing these dodgy figures. This spending review sets the tone for the rest of the Parliament, I think, but there are still some big decisions to be made. For example, the public sector pay freeze has come to an end, but we don't know what that will mean in terms of the actual increases public sector workers get. That's a decision for next year. Some areas, despite these spending increases, might still struggle to meet the pressures that they're facing. Local government is a good example of that. And the Chancellor may find that despite his generosity and largesse, he still has to come back with more. And I think one example where history teaches us to not be surprised is if he comes back with more money for the National Health Service, particularly towards the end of the Parliament when our estimates say that they might be struggling to meet all of the pressures that they're facing. And finally, yesterday was a relatively generous spending review, but it will take plenty more fiscal events like that if we are to fully undo the cuts that were made over the 2010s and fully reverse austerity for departments. Thank you very much. And now for Stuart.
Thanks, Ben. And good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk mainly about 3 tax measures that were announced yesterday on business rates, air passenger duty, and alcohol duties. Starting off with business taxes, there were a number of announcements on business taxes yesterday, but by far the biggest ones were on business rates, where we saw the publication of the government's long-awaited fundamental review of business rates. So what did this fundamental review come out with? Well, some of what was announced yesterday was not really reform at all, so much as just tax cuts. There was a continuation of some relief for sectors that have been hard hit during the pandemic, a freeze, a permanent real terms reduction, that is, in the tax rate that applies to all properties. There were some genuinely welcome reforms to the way that business rates work and move to more frequent revaluations. That's got to be a good idea. We want properties to be taxed based on their current value. And allowing a bit of time before investing in property improvements feeds through into an assessed higher property value and therefore higher tax bills. That will help to mitigate the effect of business rates on discouraging property improvements. These are relatively minor reforms. There weren't any really radical reforms yesterday. Sadly, they actually rejected some of the more promising radical reforms that they could have looked at. The only one that still seems to be under consideration is further consultation on the idea of an online sales tax to be introduced to pay for a reduction in business rates. That would be rather unfortunate. The idea that an online sales tax could redress the supposed imbalance in business rates away from bricks and mortar retail is misguided, and it would cause a number of practical difficulties on its own. Turning to air passenger duty, let me start off just by showing you what the reform does. So this chart shows the tax rates on different flights under the current system. So at the moment, there are basically two bands. Flights of less than 2,000 miles, including domestic flights, are taxed at a lower rate, and those over 2,000 miles at a higher rate. And all of those, and the same applies for premium class flights, but just all the tax rates are higher. And what was announced yesterday is shown by these black outlines, and you can see the differences are that the duty rate is going to be more or less halved from 2023 for domestic flights and increased slightly for ultra long haul flights. Now, domestic flights are a significantly bigger share of passengers than ultra long haul flights are, but they account for a smaller share of the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions associated with aviation. So what will this do to the UK's greenhouse gas emissions? Well, obviously what you'd expect to see is fewer people taking ultra-long haul flights, more people taking domestic flights. The OBR expects that to be 23,000 fewer long-haul flights, 410,000 more domestic flights. And what this reform does is kind of tilt the system more so that the tax is higher for higher emission flights. So it's making the tax more closely related to the level of emissions of a flight. So it's improving the targeting in that sense. Now, whether this will increase or reduce emissions from aviation overall is ambiguous, because we will expect to see more domestic flights, more flights overall, but flights going on average shorter distances and therefore emitting less. So it's not clear which way that would go. But the crucial point that I think has been missed in most of the commentary on this that I've seen so far is that this will not increase total UK greenhouse gas emissions in any case. And that's because domestic aviation, where we might expect to see more flights, has been brought within the UK's emissions trading system, which caps the total emissions that can come from those sectors that are covered. And so, insofar as we do see more domestic flights and more emissions from that, we have to see less emissions from other sources in order to hit the overall cap. And essentially the way that will happen is that as there's more demand for permits for flying, more demand for domestic flights, that will bid up the price of permits in the emissions trading scheme, and therefore things like the price of electricity, the price of the tax on emissions from energy-intensive industries, those taxes will go up to the point that supply and demand for those things goes down, leaving total emissions still consistent with the cap. So the headline from all of that is, perhaps surprisingly, a cut in air passenger duty will not increase total emissions, but it might well increase electricity prices. And in fact, total emissions will therefore go down, because the total emissions that won't change are those that are within the emissions trading scheme, which covers domestic flights and flights to EU destinations. But flights to long-haul destinations are outside the emissions trading scheme, and we know there'll be fewer of those because ultra-long-haul flights are going to be taxed more, and because there'll be more shifting from international to domestic flights. So actually, the net effect of the air passenger duty changes will be to reduce emissions. Now, looking in revenue terms, the air passenger duty change only costs about £30 million a year net. So the cut for domestic flights is costs slightly more than the rise for ultra-long haul raises. There were other excise duty changes announced yesterday, other cuts announced yesterday. There was yet another freeze in fuel duties and another freeze next year in alcohol duties as well. Given the slightly higher inflation, those are now starting to cost significant amounts of money, £1.5 billion and £500 million respectively, for each year as a result of those one-year freezes. More interestingly, beyond next year, there's going to be a fundamental reform of the way that alcohol duties are structured. So this chart shows you what alcohol duties look like now in terms of the tax per unit of alcohol for drinks with different alcoholic strengths. It is a mess. I'm not going to try and disentangle the spaghetti in full, but basically we tax different forms of alcohol, different types of drink, not only at different levels, but in different ways. Wine and cider in particular are broadly taxed per litre rather than based on their alcoholic content, and so stronger wine and stronger cider attract less tax per unit of alcohol, which is why you get these downward sloping curves that look a bit strange. What the government is proposing to do instead looks like this, which is quite a lot better. So first of all, the tax will now directly be related to alcohol content. So if you buy a bottle of 15% alcohol wine, you will pay 50% more duty than if you buy 10% alcohol wine. It's not a completely neat straight line, both for good reasons and bad reasons. The good reason is these kind of upward steps in it, which reflects the fact that problem drinkers, who are the ones who tend to cause the most of the social harms that alcohol consumption causes, tend to drink stronger forms of alcohol, and therefore there is a good case for taxing those at higher rates. The less good reason is the kind of slight mess of rates you see in the 3.5% to 8.5% strength band of duty, which essentially is mainly the effect of continuing to tax cider at less than half the rate we tax beer and other alcoholic drinks, which it's hard to find a really good reason. The overall effect of these changes from the messy system to the much better system is that tax on some drinks will go up and some drinks will go down, and some won't change at all. The biggest change is that if you're a red wine drinker, you will lose out. If you like your bubbly, you will gain. So, to sum up, this was not a big budget for tax. The big news was the £40 billion of tax rises announced earlier in the year, and those £40 billion of tax rises are basically increases in tax rates and reductions in tax thresholds like income tax, personal allowance, and so on, without really any fundamental reforms. What was announced yesterday did include some sensible improvements to the structure of business rates, air passenger duty, alcohol duties, but of those, only the alcohol duty reform was really a major change. We saw overall cuts to business rates, air passenger duties, alcohol duties, and fuel duties. But if anything, what these highlight is the need for more of a strategy to deal with the taxation of carbon emissions in general and aviation and motoring in particular, where we have a real mess of a system. In the case of motoring, we have fuel duties simply being allowed to erode, which doesn't encourage people to shift over to electric vehicles, but nor do we have any sense of how electric and other low-emitting vehicles will be taxed when we're all driving those instead of petrol and diesel cars. In the case of aviation, I talked about the reform to air passenger duty, but that's only part of a system where we have, for example, no tax on aviation fuel, no VAT on airline tickets. Domestic and EU flights are within the emission trading system, but flights outside that are not. The net effect of this is very complicated and a not very rational system that doesn't really help meet our climate change objectives. Similarly, on business rates, we saw some tinkering, some welcome improvements, but the fundamental review has not yet led to fundamental reform. I'll stop there and hand over to Xiaowei.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the outlook for living standards, including the effect of recent policy changes. So the overall context is that we entered the pandemic after a decade of virtually no growth in disposable household incomes. So this chart here shows average household disposable incomes in real terms over time since the financial crisis. And we see that household incomes grew by just 0.8% a year in real terms after the financial crash, as opposed to a 2.3% increase per year in the years leading up to the financial crash. Now, the stagnation in incomes was driven by a stagnation in gross earnings, which on average in 2019 was still below its level in 2008. Remarkably, over the pandemic, we seem to see little change in incomes and earnings. And this is really, really striking given the massive fall in GDP that we've seen. But looking forward, the OBR predicts that we'll see similar levels of growth in earnings and incomes that we saw prior to the pandemic. So I suppose in a way that's good news that we won't see large scarring effects from the pandemic. But on the other hand, we're really looking at a period of about 20 years of essentially no growth in earnings or incomes. Now that effect really builds up over time. So just to hammer this home, had the growth rates in gross earnings continued along their pre-financial crash trend, earnings in 2026 would be more than 40% higher than the OBR forecasts. So that's the broad picture for living standards. I'm going to now hone in on some changes we expect to see in the short term. And of course, a key part of that is changes to the tax and benefit system. So the big policy announced yesterday was an increase to the work allowance and universal credit of £500 a year, as well as a reduction in the taper rate from 63% to 55%. So I'll show you what that means using an example of a lone parent. So someone on universal credit can earn a certain amount before they start losing the universal credit entitlement. So that's the kink at the top there, which is the work allowance. And after that point, in the current system, your UC benefits are withdrawn by 63p for every additional pound that you earn. So that's the taper rate. Following the announcement made yesterday, we're going to see a very small increase in the work allowance, as well as a reduction in the taper rate. Now, as you can see in the chart, the gain to someone on universal credit, the difference between those two lines there is more for people who earn larger amounts in universal credit. And indeed, you can see with this example that a lone parent under the new system can earn really quite a lot before they are taken out of universal credit altogether. So as Paul mentioned earlier, one effect of this policy is to bring more people into universal credit. To take another example, a full-time worker on the minimum wage can expect to gain over £1,000 as a result of this policy. So another tax and benefit change we've seen since the last budget in March is the health and social care levy, which is an increase in the rate of NICs, the rate of employer, employee, and self-employed NICs. And this will affect everyone earning around £9,900 or above next year. Another tax rise that's coming up is the freeze to the personal allowance and higher rate threshold. Now, this was a change that was announced in the last budget in March 2021. Because inflation is so much higher than was projected back then, this is turning out to be a much larger tax rise than was originally intended. Under the current forecasts, the freeze in nominal terms will amount to a 10% real cut in the personal allowance and high rate threshold by 2025, as against a previous forecast of just 7% back in March. And the freeze will, by 2025, really take the high rate threshold to its lowest level in real times in history. So the fall in the personal allowance is really a reversal of perhaps a flagship policy to increase the personal allowance over the last several years, whereas I guess for the high rate threshold, it's more of a continuation of a series of cuts in real terms to the high rate threshold. So in this chart here, I'm showing the distributional effects of these policies, as well as a number of changes to duties that Stuart mentioned, which also have a minor effect on households across the income distribution. And we see here that next year, as compared to this year, households towards the bottom of the income distribution will gain from these policies by around 1%, whereas households towards the top of the distribution will lose up to 1% a year on average. It's worth noting, of course, that the increase in universal credit comes on top of a series of benefit cuts since 2015. So if you consider the changes announced this time round in the context of longer-term changes to benefits, comparing the system next year with the system back in 2015 before these benefit cuts were implemented, we see that poorer households, especially the poorest households, are still worse off than they were before 2015. However, that's because many of the poorest households here do not have anyone in work and therefore wouldn't benefit from this change to work allowances and the universal credit taper. So actually, for working households who are on benefits, the changes yesterday more than offset the changes to taxes and benefits since 2015. Now, of course, the previous chart just showed tax and benefit changes and doesn't factor in things like the change in earnings, including a rise in the national living wage to £9.50 an hour, which is a nominal rise of 6.6%. So here I'm going to incorporate earnings and look at what this will mean for real incomes using a couple of examples. So I'll start by looking at earnings growth. So the nominal earnings rise of 4% forecast by the OBR is just about enough to outpace inflation, leading to a small rise in annual real incomes for the median earner. For someone working full-time on the minimum wage, they'd expect to see a larger increase as a result of the national living wage increase, which amounts to a 3.2% rise in real terms. However, for someone working on the minimum wage and on universal credit, they would see a much smaller increase because part of that increase in earnings would be clawed back through reduced benefits. So that's just looking at earnings, but of course, as I've said, there's two big tax changes coming up. And you see here that for the median earner, these tax changes more than eat up the modest gains in earnings that they're forecast to have in the next year, meaning that their real incomes next year will be lower than this year. And that's not the case for a minimum wage worker who would see a slight increase in their real incomes over the coming year. And of course, for a minimum wage worker who also receives universal credit, they would see a much larger boost as a result of the policies announced yesterday, leading to a total change of over £1,000 in the coming year. Now, of course, it's worth bearing in mind that the £1,000 universal credit uplift has recently been removed. So whilst these policies make them much better off than had they not been enacted, they still won't be much better off in real terms compared to a couple of months ago. Now, one thing that was missing from yesterday's budget was any increase in support for workless households. In particular, the around 4 million workless families who are on UC, who would have recently lost the temporary uplift to universal credit. There's also an issue of rising inflation, which means that the real value of the benefits would be eroded. And this is a common issue. It's because benefits adjust with a lag. They're only operated once a year, and they're operated using lagged measures of inflation. Now, this is always the case, but it hasn't been a problem for a while because we haven't seen such high rates of inflation. But now as prices rise, this will start to put a squeeze on people's living standards. So the high inflation means that on top of the £1,000 universal credit uplift that just been removed, workless families in universal credit will lose an additional 1% in real terms by April 22 compared to a year earlier, as a result of benefits not keeping up with inflation, and another 3% before benefits catch up with inflation in April 2023. It's worth noting that this really reflects a continuation of a long-term trend in the benefit system away from supporting workless families towards supporting in-work low-income families. And indeed, as Paul noted earlier, benefits for out-of-work adults without children has not increased in real terms for about 50 years. So to bring this all together, remarkably, living standards appear to be relatively unaffected by the pandemic, which is really amazing given what we've been through. But looking forward, really looks like more of the same, so more stagnation in incomes and earnings. And we're now really looking at 2 decades of virtually no income growth in real terms. High inflation in the coming months means that modest earnings growth will be eroded and many households will see their living standards fall. One exception is low-income, low-paid households who are in work, who can expect to see modest gains as a result of the universal credit policy announced yesterday, as well as the increase in the national living wage. However, there's been a lack of additional support for workless households who are likely to struggle in coming years as inflation erodes their living standards. Great, so I think I'll hand over back to Paul.
Thank you so much to Carl, Ben, Stuart and Jawei. If the technical people do any more to fix the sound, we're still getting complaints from people watching on YouTube. So I'm sorry for that. Now, so I need to keep an eye on the audience and on Zoom and on the Slido. So that's going to be quite difficult for me. Let me start in the room, since you kindly made the effort to come along. Larry and then the lady there.
2 decades of zero real terms increase. Is there any historical precedent for it, or do we have to go back hundreds of years to find anything comparable? The second thing is the freezing of the higher rate threshold. How many more people are going to be paying higher rate tax now, say, than previously, or even 10 or 15 years ago? Because presumably the numbers of people paying higher rate tax is going up and up and up, isn't it?
It is. The answer to the first question is yes, this is unprecedented. And I think, Xiaowei, you have the answer to the second question.
I'm afraid we were just about crunching it before this presentation. I don't have the numbers for that yet. We do have some very pretty slides on the personal allowance and high rate threshold that didn't make the cut, so we'll add that number to the slide pack that we put online.
It went up to about 12% of adults or something, didn't it?
It's
higher rate taxes. 11, yeah. So about 11% of adults paying higher rate tax, up from about 3% in 1990 from memory.
4% in 1990.
4%, so pretty much a quadrupling, trebling, sorry. My maths is terrible.
Yes, so as I said, in real terms, the higher rate threshold has basically not changed since it was introduced in 1990 during a period of massive earnings growth. So much more people will be pulled into the higher rate of tax.
Hi, Kate Ferguson at The Sun. Can you talk a little bit about the risks of inflation and potentially higher interest rates and how that could impact like an average household, people with a mortgage? Thanks.
Well, we can talk a little bit about that. As I said, the OBR, they closed their forecast at an inflation forecast of about 4%, and then said, well, some more stuff has happened since, and it might get up to 5%. And as Xiaowei showed, that has immediate effects on people's living standards, and indeed, because benefits, for example, go up in April in line with inflation in September, a 3% benefit increase when inflation might be at 5% will leave people worse off. In terms of interest rate rises, we put out a small thing about that last week. I mean, I don't think anyone is expecting very substantive interest rate rises. I mean, if the Bank of England goes above 1%, I think everyone will be absolutely astounded. So that doesn't change things dramatically in terms of where we've come over the last couple of decades, which is very big reductions in interest rates leading to increased asset prices. Clearly, people with mortgages will be somewhat negatively affected, those with savings somewhat positively affected. But I think it's important in these circumstances not to overstate those effects. And of course, real interest rates, if inflation is at 4 or 5%, will be even more negative than they've been in recent years. I'm going to go now. I'm going to take 2 or 3 from Zoom, then I'll take a couple from Slido, then I'll come back to the room. Ed Conway.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Amazing. Wow, I'm sorry I'm not there, but seeing it is making me very nostalgic for that airless room. So next time. A couple, actually, if I can. First of all, let's imagine Rishi Sunak wanted a pre-election giveaway in 2023 or 24. How much leeway has he got against his fiscal rules? Like, did you have a number in billions of pounds? And just a second question, Stuart, your bit about APD and emissions, I thought that was fascinating. It hadn't really occurred to me that it would actually reduce CO2 emissions. I just wonder, is there any way of doing the same thing for the budget as a whole? Like fuel duty, et al. In toto, does it seem to be kind of more green, reducing emissions, or pushing them up, or things equal based on previous plans?
Carl, I think you came up with a number for how much headroom is possible.
Yeah, so let's imagine perhaps a slightly strange world where the forecasts we got yesterday are completely correct and everything goes exactly as the OBR suggests yesterday. And then we get to, say, 2024, we're approaching general election. I think in that world you could imagine the Chancellor being able to cut taxes by something like £7 billion and leave himself with approximately the same amount of wiggle room going forwards as what he's got at the moment, which is not a lot of wiggle room. So that would be the kind of scale. If he did do that kind of tax cut, he wouldn't be a tax-cutting Chancellor because there'd be these huge tax increases we've already had. It would only offset a minority of that. That could be the kind of magnitude. Clearly, there's uncertainty. The economy receipts might not turn out to be as strong as we perhaps expect and hope them to be. He may also find that if he has got wiggle room, there may well be demands, for example, from the NHS for more spending. So it's not clear that even if he has got money to give away, it would all go to tax cuts. But that's the kind of sum, I think, on the back of an envelope I'd suggest would be available if the forecasts are correct.
I think it's also worth saying that in the longer run, the pressures from health spending, demographic change, and so on mean that I think our guess is that the tax burden will remain at least at its current level into the longer run, possibly rise. But that doesn't mean that there isn't space for temporary cuts or headline-grabbing cuts in the meantime. Stuart, I think it's fair to say we haven't worked out what the overall impact on carbon emissions is like to be, but it'd be quite interesting to see the Treasury produce such numbers.
Yeah, you need to give me at least another 10 minutes to do that. The OBR says that the government hasn't made an assessment even of the effects of the APD change on emissions, let alone the whole budget. I mean, there are a number of measures that directly affect emissions, certainly on the tax side. Again, don't forget freezing fuel duty every year is a cut in by far the biggest tax we've got on greenhouse gas emissions at the moment. There are also other bits and pieces like business rates relief for investments in clean energy generation and storage, and so on. I think even on the tax side of yesterday's announcements, I think it's hard to reach an overall assessment once you start thinking about the effects of changes in public spending and so on as well. I don't even want to begin.
Hugh's iPhone.
Thank you, Paul. That's me. Hugh Pym, BBC. You mentioned the DH budget going up 4.1% a year real, I think, over the spending period, and I think NHS England 3.8. What do you know about the rest of the DH budget, how it's being carved up between public health and health education and training of staff? Because I think those two latter elements are seen as very important. Have you got any detail on that?
Ben.
No, not yet.
Give him 10 minutes.
Give me 10 minutes. I don't think it's been published. We were actually looking for that last night because, as you say, one of the key concerns about getting through the NHS backlog is it's all right pumping money into new surgical hubs or new diagnostic centres or new hospitals, but you need the staff to fill them, and people have been saying there's a workforce strategy needed, and it could have been published yesterday, but it wasn't. In terms of the breakdown between public health, Health Education England, also the new Health and Security Agency, the new replacement for Public Health England, the National Institute for Health Protection, I think from memory, plus also some money for social care that's being directed through the DHSC budget. All of that will at some point be broken down, one presumes, but we don't think we've got that to hand just yet. Sorry, Hugh.
Matilda Martin.
Can I just ask one follow-up?
Oh, go on then.
Sorry, very quickly. This is an obvious question, but Barnett is all on the top of everything you've put on the slide, presumably.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Matilda Martin.
Hi there, it's Matilda from the Times Education Supplement. I just had a question in terms of schools funding. So the Treasury has said that schools will get an extra £4.7 billion by 2024 to 25. Which combined with plans announced at the spending review in 2019 will restore per pupil funding to 2010 levels in real terms. But it also said that this uplift for the core schools budget will level up education standards by supporting delivery of the government's commitment to increase teacher starting salaries to £30,000. So will restoring per pupil spending to 2010 levels be undermined by schools having to fund the £30,000 starting salary costs?
Do you want to have a go, Ben? I don't suppose we've got Luke on the line anywhere, have we?
I think Luke is on the Zoom
Luke,
call.
Luke, right, excellent, fantastic. Ben's off the hook.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, it's a wonderful technology, at least. In short, I don't think it undermines the ability of schools to deliver £30,000 starting salaries. Clearly, one of the big things that schools spend their money on is teacher salaries, and part of the cuts that school spending over the last decade has been delivered through real terms cuts of teacher salaries. And as part of the spending review, the government will clearly have made an assumption for how much extra will be spent on teacher salaries over the next few years. How much is actually spent will depend on what the pay review body recommends and what the government actually does. But there will clearly be an allowance as part of the settlement for extra spending on teacher salaries.
But I suppose, is it your view that there's room for that £30,000 starting salary plus some kind of at least flat real for other teachers and not having to cut staff within the overall budget allocated?
I think it is impossible to be precise at the moment because we don't know what's going to be recommended in terms of salary increases for more experienced teachers. In short, probably yes. The increase in spending pupils in 2022 is 4% in real terms, which was a bit of a surprise and quite an increase. Then a further 1% real terms increase per year up to 2024-25 represents further real terms increases. So there is allowance for real terms increases in teacher salaries, and probably on a level that would allow for real terms increases for more experienced teachers as well.
Fantastic. Hopefully that answers your question, Matilda. David Parsley, then I'll come to you, the Slido.
Hi, thanks for that. I was looking at, you've mentioned several times about councils possibly having to cut services as a result of the spending review. I just wondered how deep you might think those cuts need to be, and do you believe councils may be forced to seek local referendum to raise council tax bills above the 3% cap? And finally, what does that mean for social care provision?
Do we have David Phillips online? No, it's going to have to be you, Ben.
I think I'll be a poor substitute for David. I think also probably makes sense, Paul, to try and combine this with some of the questions on the Slido from Colin Mars at Public Finance and Alan Screeding and Anonymous. So first, I think I'd lay out sort of where the money's coming from for the local government budget, which is related to some of these questions now. I'll come back to that. So basically, there's a big increase in grant funding next year at 1.6 billion, which is then frozen. By the end of the period, there's an extra 2 billion per year for social care reforms, which mean that overall local government grant funding will be about 3.6 billion higher. And combined with assumptions about council tax, that means that spending power will go in real terms by 3% per year, but once you strip out that 2 billion for social care, it becomes more like 1.8%. So 1.8% real terms per year to meet not the costs of the new means test and the cap, but sort of ongoing costs of an aging population, rising unit costs for social care, not least because of increases in the minimum wage and increases in employer NICS contributions, which mainly be paid by private providers and things like that. Now, some of my colleagues have produced estimates of the spending pressures facing local authorities, which are uncertain and depend on all sorts of inputs, but it looks like this will mean councils struggling to meet all of those pressures, and you might be looking at some probably fairly modest, but some real terms cuts perhaps to some areas. Now, that won't be on the scale of those experienced in the 2010s, but they might still be uncomfortable. And on council tax specifically, so as I said in my presentation, it's quite surprising actually that they're saying 2% council tax increase without a referendum, plus 1% extra for social care, which is less than they've allowed recently. And because some councils don't do social care, equates to about 2.8% on average. Now, some councils may decide to have a referendum to try and raise more money. Others may decide to cut some budgets. It's sort of a lot of that is down to local choice. And a big, crucial part of this will be how money is allocated between departments, which we won't get until the local government finance settlement later this year. So I think I've just about answered it. If you have any further questions, I would point you towards my colleagues. And actually, I've got a message through right now from my colleagues who says, the scale of cuts needed will depend in part on how much business rates revenues grow as we recover from COVID-19. We don't think it'll be back to the austerity of the 2010s, and this is still a real terms increase, but I think we'd say, it could be tight in some areas. That's just about done the job.
And while we're on local government finance, there's a very large number of people who voted up. Do we know anything about the impact of the budget on London as opposed to non-London local authorities?
I can try and hang on until David sends me a message, but in the meantime,
it's just a minute.
I would say that this important fact is that this is the overall level of local government funding, but that won't be allocated until later this year. And as we've said lots of times before, and I will say again while I wait for David, the way in which this money is allocated is actually based on out-of-date formula and out-of-date data. So it doesn't take into account, for example, the fact that the population of Tower Hamlets, which is in London, has gone up by more than 20%, or the population of Blackpool has fallen by a couple of percent. But all the data and formula used to allocate funding between councils is based on those out-of-date populations. So that's in dire need of an update, something called the Fair Funding Review, and once that takes place, those should change. In the meantime, the financial settlement in December should provide some more information, as is David right now, who says London councils have low tax rates and therefore rely more on grants. And he's still typing. So those that are relying more on grants will be more affected by the cash terms freeze after next year. Those that richer areas are more prosperous can get more from an increase in council tax. And David has worryingly stopped typing, so I think we'll pause for now.
Brilliant. You should definitely be on just a minute. It is extraordinary. I mean, just to repeat what Ben just said. I mean, we are still giving councils funding allocations based on their populations of getting about 7 or 8 years ago now, and those populations have changed in very different ways over that period, and that really does need to change. Top of the pops, other one that on the well, certainly vote. So at the top of my screen anyway on Slido, which I think maybe you answered actually, Zhao Wei, because this came in before you spoke. How much worse off will middle income earners be in real terms? And who's in that category? And how well will other wage earners fare?
Yeah, so the example I showed of the median earner showed a fall in real terms of about £180 a year. So higher earners than that, people on the high rate threshold would lose more than that. because of the freeze in the high rate threshold, whereas earners lower down the distribution who get UC would benefit from the UC policies that we saw yesterday, and those who are on the minimum wage will also benefit from the uplift in the minimum wage.
I mean, I think it would be fair to say, wouldn't it, that given what we know at the moment, it looks like living standards over the next few years, low earners are probably going to do quite a lot better than high earners, unless the wage distribution disequalizes, because low earners are benefiting from increases in minimum wage and this increase in the generosity of tax credit, of universal credit, whilst higher earners are losing more from national insurance contribution increases and the freezing of tax thresholds. So looking over this period, I mean, we're looking probably, unless something happens to the wage distribution, at a compression of inequality. Is that, would you say that's fair, Xiaowei?
Yeah, I think that's right. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen to the underlying pay distribution aside from the minimum wage. But looking in previous years, we have seen higher growth at the bottom as a result of these rises in the minimum wage. So I think that's a fair assumption going forward.
Great. I'm going to take a couple more on Slido, then I'll come back to the room and then back to Zoom. But just very quickly, Chancellor didn't mention climate change is top of the pops now. What's the IFS take on the emission? I think two things. First, there was actually a much more comprehensive than ever before net zero strategy published a week before the budget. I should mention an interest here as a member of the Climate Change Committee, and the Climate Change Committee did put out a response to that saying, in broad terms, this is quite a big step forward. So it's possible at least that the Chancellor didn't feel the need to mention that. Equally, as Stuart said, I mean, at the 12th year in a row of freezing fuel duties and sort of fiddling around with air passenger duty didn't really suggest that it was top of his agenda for the budget. And the last one I'll take before I come to the room, which is the next one on the list, says you implicitly say we need more school spending, no increase in 15 years, but 2024 level higher than pre-2010. Does that mean Labour weren't generous enough? No, that's not really what we're saying. And broadly speaking, spending on public services you would expect to rise in line at least with the size of the economy, and indeed with something like education, which we normally think of as a superior good. In other words, as we get richer, we want more of it proportional to our income. You would generally expect that to rise at least in line with the size of the economy, if not faster. And it hasn't. And indeed, it has risen a lot slower than the size of the economy. As Luke said, partly through squeezing teacher pay, but through more general actually reductions in the amount per pupil until 2024. So it's not a statement that we think what was there in 2010 was inadequate. It's more a statement that this is a very unusual period, resulting in a really significant squeeze on resources in the education sector, and particularly actually in the further education and sixth form sector, which we didn't particularly talk about. Now let me come back to the room. Are there any questions in the room? Yes, Andy.
I was just wondering if you could come up with a pounds and pence figure for that 40% less than we would have been had we continued pre-crisis trends earnings figure. Can we do it in pounds and pence? Like how much less the average person will earn as a result?
We do have that figure in the underlying data in the chart, but I can't remember it off the top of my head.
We'll see if someone can find it out in the next few minutes. Anyone else in the room? Well, in that case, I will return to the Zoom screen. Ben Chu.
Hi, Paul. So these new fiscal targets are pretty familiar, but they seem to have been flipped slightly. So debt reduction now seems to be the primary target as a show GDP, and the balanced budget is the supplementary one. Just wondering, is that significant at all, and is it welcome? Also, you've touched on this with teachers' pay, but to what extent broadly across the public sector are pay increases, the unfrozen public sector pay increases, do they risk eating into the generosity of the more generous totals for departments that were announced yesterday? If you could speak a little bit more about that more broadly across the public sector, thanks.
Fiscal rules question, and then Ben can take public pay.
Sure. I mean, it's certainly true that the Treasury's document says that the new mandate is about debt, which is a change from the past, where it was always about the current budget, and it describes 3 supplementary targets. The OBR took a different approach and said, well, we're going to look at both the debt one and the current budget one in particular, because the Chancellor focuses on those in his speeches. In terms of is it significant, is it the right thing to do? Well, I think over the longer run, what matters is trying to get debt down so that we're less exposed to interest rate rises, so that when the next nasty surprise comes along, government can increase debt and support households, public services and businesses, just as it did in the financial crisis, just as it did in the pandemic. It's much harder, though, to come up with rules that work well for debt. We know that debt needs to move around quite a bit from year to year. I think it's much easier to have a kind of medium-term target for current budget that people might agree with. And I think that's demonstrated by the fact that actually, Gordon Brown started a process of saying, well, I think it's right that we should collect enough in tax to pay for day-to-day spending. George Osborne adopted a similar target. Rishi Sunak has a similar target. In opposition, John McDonnell proposed a similar target, and Rachel Reeves has also got a similar target. So there's quite a lot of agreement about what we want to do with the current budget in the medium term. For debt, I think it is intrinsically quite a lot harder to have a good target. So I think maybe the economics say, yes, you want to target debt in the very long run, but in practice, that's really hard to do.
Ben, will public sector pay increases be affordable? Will they eat up all of the increase?
Just before that, Jawed, do you want to reply to Andy?
Excellent.
We dug up the figure for you. So it's just under £13,000 in today's terms per year. Sorry, the difference between the what would be the average earnings, gross earnings pre-tax in 2026 had we continued the pre-2008 trend compared to what's been forecast by the OBR for 2026.
Would you mind giving me the top and bottom numbers?
Oh, yeah, I see. Yes, can do that. That's okay. So the bottom figure is 30,800 roughly. The top figure is 43,700 in today's terms.
30,800 and 40,000.
700. 43,000.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth saying, we're not saying that there is a world in which earnings would have grown that fast, but it is just that's the trend over how long? So that's a sort of 20-year trend that had been.
Sorry, Ben, back to public sector pay. All else being equal, a more generous public sector pay settlement means departments have less to spend on other things. What we don't know yet is how generous public sector pay settlements for different workers will be. That will depend on the recommendations of the pay review bodies next year and what the government chooses to do in response. Clearly, if you are giving a department a 4% increase each year and you're increasing pay by 4% each year, that's very different to if pay was only going up by 1%. But I think that it's also...
The 4% we've been talking about is real, and when you normally talk about pay increases, you talk nominal there.
Sure, but just put them in the same terms for now. But the point really is that the real terms projections are also based on forecasts for inflation, which in turn build in what the OBR thinks is going to happen to public sector and private sector pay, and their forecasts imply public sector pay rising roughly in line with private sector pay, which means that it's sort of reflected in the figures to begin with. So I think that that's all sort of implicitly built into the spending plans and forecasts.
So there is space in there for some real terms increases in public sector pay, and there would still be a bit left over.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Anna Isaac.
Hi there. Some of your previous comments suggested that this might be a budget that wasn't very good for younger people. I wonder if you could expand on that slightly and explain how to avoid that in the context of our ageing population. And secondly, if I may, what kind of a budget would be better to see for people that can't work because they can't afford childcare, but yet may still be in receipt of benefits? Thank you.
Did we say anything? I'm not sure what we said about younger people. Did anyone mention that? I mean, I think there is a sort of. Let me just reflect on where I think we are with sort of the generational distribution of the policy impacts in recent years. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that contrary to what the evidence suggested a year ago, it doesn't look like the pandemic has really hit young people more than older people, at least young people of working age more than older people. That's a big change. If you look at the labour market stats, if anything, its participation has fallen among older groups rather than younger groups. I think the second thing to say is there's still a really big worry, I think, about people even younger than that who are still in the education system, and in particular, an increase in the inequality between poorer and better off kids in the education system. And I think the third thing I'd say about the impact on generations is, it looks like we have a continued period of significantly negative real interest rates, probably therefore continued high levels of asset prices, and very poor levels of earnings growth, all of which tends to favour those who are older and wealthier relative to those who are younger and less wealthy. On childcare issues, is Christine here or online? And if not, does anyone else want to have a go?
Christine helpfully sent me some numbers.
Oh, so marvellous! We have a whole factory of people out there giving us numbers.
There was a substantial increase in childcare funding. I think it's, from memory, 170 million, I think, by the final year. And I think that what that means is a big bump up in real terms funding for childcare providers next year. It'll then tail off slightly as inflation eats into it. But it is a bump up that takes us back towards where we were in the early 2010s. And that 170 million a year helps avoid ever harder squeezes on providers, but it might not be directly felt by families, but it should at least stop some providers going bust. And there was, I think, from memory, more support for sort of core funding for childcare providers, but less for sort of special needs or special requirements children. So I think that's a bit of a distinction there. And that's the limit of my knowledge.
I think if you want to know more, if you follow Christine Farquharson on Twitter, she's got quite a useful thread on all of that. And I think one thing it's worth saying is that the sort of Chancellor made a bit of a fuss of family hubs. These are pretty small beer, and certainly small beer relative to the cuts in Sure Start over the last period. Actually, there's a... Oops, sorry.
Add something on young people.
Oh, yes, please.
So it is worth noting that in terms of personal taxes, the taxes that were raised were taxed on earnings, so both NICs and changes to the personal allowance and high rate threshold. So those will affect younger people who are working rather than pensioners who are out of work. Whereas the Chancellor perhaps could have chosen to raise something like council tax that would have been incident on homeowners and therefore affect pensioners as well.
Yep. Actually, having said small beer, there's a question here about can the IFS confirm that they changed the alcohol duty of small beer? But I think I don't think we'll go there. Rachel Wearmouth.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions about local government. We've seen councils in Slough and Croydon effectively go bust in the last year. Do you think the spending review offers local authorities protection from financial peril, or could we see others have issued Section 114 notices? And secondly, the budget documents yesterday assume a 3% rises in council tax, but they also have a get-out clause in that final rises are yet to be agreed by the Department for Levelling Up. Do you think the Treasury might be forced to allow higher rises like 4%, 5%, or even 6%?
I don't know. I don't think we know the answer to whether anyone else is going to go bust. I think it is worth saying that these are, as you know, over the last year, the Treasury or the government has stepped in to support a number of councils particularly badly affected by the pandemic, where they've, through no fault of their own, owned an airport, for example, had to be bailed out. I don't know if you've got anything more to add to any of that, Ben.
Very briefly, I think some of the Section 114 notices, or those who came close, were often, council-specific features like owning an airport or Eastbourne being very reliant on tourism and conferences and things like that. More generally, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this will mean real terms increases in council funding, whereas they might have previously been worried about facing real terms cuts. So they will be having increases in their budget, and you'd hope that staves off some of the financial risks that those councils face. But as for the very specifics, I don't feel able to go much further.
Has David written anything?
Not yet.
No, not yet. We'll come back to that if he does. One last question from Slido, and this is for you, Xiaowei, I think. Can you clarify the chart comparing real incomes in the coming year? £1,160 benefit does not include the loss from the £20 a week universal credit cut. Is that right? What would workless households look like on the chart?
Yeah, that's right. The £1,160 benefit doesn't include the loss of the £20 universal credit cut. So that was announced as a temporary measure over COVID, so we didn't include that in the modelling or the distributional analysis. So of course, even though they're better off than they would have been under the last permanent system, not including this temporary uplift, they're not much better off than they were just a couple of months ago before the uplift was withdrawn. In terms of workless households, in the long term, there's been basically no change to the tax and benefit system affecting workless households. There might have been some very minor changes to duties that will affect them as well, but essentially no change on that front. But in the short term, the key thing I'd emphasise is that because benefits will lag inflation for another couple of years, they will face a squeeze in the cost of living in the coming months and years.
Great, thank you. Were we supposed to finish at 11:45? Yes. We're already 5 minutes past the end then. I'm really sorry for the large number of questions on Slido that didn't get answered, and apologies for those who got a poor sound quality for this. Thank you ever so much to all of those who have attended in person. Thank you for all of those who have asked questions, either electronically or in person. My colleagues will be happy to answer further questions over the next hour or so, but I suspect not right through into the early evening, by which time we'll mostly be in bed. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here, everyone for listening, and particularly thank you not just to my colleagues who have spoken to you this morning, but also to the large numbers of others who both helped them answer some of the questions, but in particular put some of the presentations together. And hopefully we'll see you in a year's time, and ideally not before.